right, so Mary just went through. Oh, by the way, greetings. By the way, Mary just went through the purification, the presentation at the temple, and we saw the death of Simeon. Now they are making a pit stop in Nazareth, and then they'll have to fly, quote unquote, fly to Egypt. Subtext: Return of the Holy Family to Nazareth. I saw the Holy Family returning to Nazareth by a much more direct route than that by which they had gone to Bethlehem. On their first journey, they had shunned the inhabited districts and seldom put up at an inn, but now they took the straight route, which was much shorter. Joseph had in his cloak pocket some little rolls of thin yellow shining leaves on which were letters. He had received them from the holy kings. The shekels of Judas were thicker and in the form of a tongue. I saw the Holy Family arrive at Anne's in Nazareth. The eldest sister of Mary, Mary Heli, with her daughter, Mary Cleophas, a woman from Elizabeth's place, and that one of Anne's maids who had been with Mary in Bethlehem, were there. A feast was held such as had been celebrated at the departure of the child Mary for the temple. Lamps burned above the table, and there were some old priests present. Things went on quietly. Though there was great joy over the child Jesus, yet it was a calm inward joy. I've never seen much excitement among the holy souls. They partook of a slight repast, the women as usual eating apart from the men. I can remember no more of this vision, although I must have been present in a very real way, for I had to accomplish in it a work of prayer. In Anne's garden, notwithstanding the season, I saw numbers of pears, plums, and other fruits still on the trees, although the leaves had already fallen. I have always forgotten to say a word about the weather in Palestine during the winter season, because being so accustomed to it myself, I think that everyone else knows it too. I often see rain and fog, and sometimes snow, but it soon melts away, and I see many trees upon which fruit is still hanging. There are in the year several harvests, the first in what corresponds to our spring. In the present season, winter, I see people on the roads wrapped up in mantles which are thrown over the head also. On the sacred night of Christmas, I always see everything green, blossoming, and full of flowers, the animals frolicsome, the vineyards laden with luscious grapes, and I hear the sweet caroling of birds, but immediately after, it is again quiet, and just as it is usually there at this season. The tree outside of Bethlehem, and under which Mary stood while Joseph was seeking an inn, was, as long as she had remained under it, quite green. It afforded ample shelter, but when she left it, it resumed in wintry nakedness. This was perhaps only a mark of reverence, but the Blessed Virgin was fully conscious of it. The shepherd field was, however, already green at this season, for they watered it. The road from Anne's house to Joseph's in Nazareth was about 1/2 hour's distant, and ran between gardens and hills. I saw Joseph at Anne's loading 2 asses with many different things, and going on before with Anne's maid to Nazareth. Mary followed with Anne, who carried the child Jesus. Mary and Joseph had no care of the housekeeping. They were provided with all things by Anne, who often went to see them. I saw her maid carrying provisions to them in 2 baskets, one on her head, the other in her hand. I saw the Blessed Virgin knitting or crocheting little robes. To her right side was fastened a ball of wool, and she had in her hands 2 short needles of bone, I think, with little hooks at the end. One was about a foot long, the other shorter. The stitches were arranged on the needles above the hooks, over which, in doing the work, the thread was thrown, and the stitch thus formed. The finished web hung between the two needles. I saw Mary thus working, either standing or sitting by the child Jesus, who lay in his little basket cradle. I saw Joseph, out of long strips of bark, yellow, brown, and green, plaiting screens, large surfaces, and covers for ceilings. He had a stock of this woven board-like work piled under a shed near the house. He wove into them all kinds of patterns, stars, hearts, etc. I thought as I looked at them that he had no idea how soon he would have to leave them all. I saw the Holy Family while at Nazareth, visited also by Mary Heli. She came with St. Anne, bringing with her her grandson, a boy of about 4 years, the child of her daughter, Mary Cleophas. I saw the holy women sitting together, caressing the child Jesus and laying it in the little boy's arms. They acted just as people do nowadays. Mary Heli lived in a little town about 3 hours east of Nazareth. She had a house almost as large as her mother's. It had a courtyard surrounded by a wall, and in it a well with a pump. On pressing with the foot at the base of the pump, the water flowed out into a stone basin before it. Mary Heli's husband was named Cleophas. Their daughter Mary Cleophas, who had married Alphaeus, lived at the other end of town. That evening, I saw the holy women praying together. They were standing in front of a little table, which was fastened to the wall and covered with red and white. On it lay a roll which Mary unfolded and hung upon the wall. A figure was embroidered on it in pale colors. It was like a corpse entirely enveloped in a long white mantle. It had something in its arms. I saw a picture like it at Anne's during the festival before Mary's departure for her presentation in the temple. A lamp was burning during their prayer. Mary stood a little in front of the table with Anne and Mary Heli on either side. At certain times they crossed their hands upon their breast, folded them together, or stretched them forth. Mary read out of a roll that lay before her. They prayed in measured and steady tones. It reminded me of choir chanting. Subtext: the flight into Egypt. When Herod saw that the kings did not return, he thought they had failed to find Jesus, and the whole affair seemed to be dying out. But after Mary's return to Nazareth, Herod heard of Simeon's and Anna's prophecy at the presentation of the child in the temple, and his fears were reawakened. I saw him in as great disquietude as at the time of the king's stay in Jerusalem. He was conferring with some aged Jews who read to him from long rolls of writings mounted on rods. He had given orders for a number of men to be gathered together in a large court, and there provided with weapons and uniforms. Things went on as they do with us when soldiers are recruited. I saw that he sent these troops to various places around Jerusalem, from which the mothers were to be summoned to the holy city. He caused their numbers to be everywhere ascertained. He took these precautions in order to prevent the tumult that would necessarily follow if the news of the projected slaughter of the children was spread. I saw those soldiers in 3 different places, in Bethlehem, in Gilgal, and in Hebron. The inhabitants were in great consternation, because not able to divine why a garrison was placed in their temples. The soldiers remained about 9 months in those places, and the murder of the little ones began when John was about 2 years old. Anne and Mary Heli were still at the home of the Holy Family in Nazareth. Mary, with her child, slept in the apartment to the right behind the fireplace, and to the left, and between hers and that of Joseph, Mary Heli. These rooms were not so high as the house itself, and were cut off from one another only by wicker partitions. The ceiling also was of wickerwork. Mary's couch was surrounded by a curtain or screen. At her feet, in his own little bed, lay the infant Jesus within Mary's reach when she sat upright. I saw a radiant youth standing at the side of Joseph's couch and speaking to him. Joseph sat up, but overcome by sleep again laid down. Then the youth caught him by the hand and raised him up. Joseph, now thoroughly aroused, stood up, and the youth vanished. Then I saw Joseph going to the lamp that burned in the center of the house and getting a light. He proceeded to Mary's chamber, knocked, and asked permission to enter. I saw him going in and speaking to Mary, who, however, did not open her screen. After this he went out to the stable for the ass, and returning, went into a room wherein were stored all kinds of household goods. He was getting things ready for a journey. Mary arose quickly, clothed herself for traveling, and went to arouse Anne, who got up at once along with Mary Heli and the little boy. I cannot express how touching was the trouble of Anne and the sister. Anne embraced Mary over and over again with many tears, clasping her to her heart as if she were never again to see her. The sister threw herself flat on the floor and wept. Only just before setting out did they take the infant Jesus from his little bed. They pressed the child to their heart, and it was given to the little boy to embrace. Mary then took the child upon her breast, resting it in a strip of stuff that fastened over her shoulders. A long mantle enveloped both mother and child, and Mary wore over her head a large veil, which hung down on both sides of her face. She made but few preparations for the journey, and all she did was done quietly and quickly. I did not see her even swathing the child afresh. The holy travelers took only a few things with them, far fewer than they had brought from Bethlehem, only a little bundle and some coverings. Joseph had a leathern bottle filled with water and a basket with compartments in it, in which were loaves, little jugs, and live birds. There was a cross seat for Mary and the child on the ass, also a little footboard. They went forward a short distance with Anne, for they took the road in the direction to her house, only somewhat more to the left. When Joseph approached with the ass, Anne again embraced and blessed Mary, who then mounted and rode off. It was not yet midnight when they had left the house. The child Jesus was 12 weeks old. I had seen 3 times 4 weeks. I saw Mary Heli going to her mother's house in order to send Eliud with a servant to Nazareth, after which she had returned with the boy to her own home. I next saw Anne in Joseph's house, packing everything up for Eliud and the servant to remove to her own house. The Holy Family passed by many places that night, and not till morning did I see them resting under a shed and taking a little refreshment. I saw them taking their first night's lodging in the little village of Nazara, between Legio and Masaloth. The poor oppressed people of this place who lodged the Holy Family were not, properly speaking, Jews. They had to go far over a mountainous road to Samaria to worship, for the temple was on Mount Gerizim, and they always had to work like slaves on the temple of Jerusalem and other public buildings. The Holy Family could go no further. They were well received by these outcasts, with whom they remained the whole of the following day. On their return from Egypt, they again visited those 4 people. They did the same, both going and returning from the temple the first time that the child Jesus had made the journey to it. The whole family at a later period was baptized by John, and they afterwards joined the disciples of Jesus. The Holy Family on their flight met only 3 inns at which to spend the night, here at Nazara, again at Anim or Erganim, among the camel dealers, and lastly among the robbers. At other times they rested during their tiresome wanderings in valleys and caves in the most out-of-the-way places. Further on from Nazara, I saw them hidden under the great pine tree, near which Mary, on her journey to Bethlehem, had been so cold. The persecution of Herod was known in these parts, and it was consequently unsafe for them. The Ark of the Covenant had once rested under this tree, when Joshua assembled the people and made them renounce their idols. Later, I saw the Holy Family by a well and balsam bush, resting and refreshing themselves. The branches of the bush were notched, and out of them oozed the balsam in drops. The child Jesus lay on Mary's lap, his little feet bare. On the left behind them lay Jerusalem, far above the level of the country in which they then were. When the Holy Family had passed the walls of Gaza, I saw them in the wilderness. No words can depict the difficulties of this journey. They always traveled a mile eastward of the ordinary highway, and as they shunned the public inns, they suffered the want of all necessaries. I saw them all quite exhausted, with not a drop of water, the little jug was empty, drawing near to a low bush some distance from the road. The Blessed Virgin alighted from the ass and sat down upon the dry grass. Suddenly there jetted high before them a spring of water, which spread over the plain. I witnessed their joy. Joseph dug a hole at a little distance and led the ass to it. The poor beast gladly drank from it as it filled. Mary bathed the child in the spring and refreshed herself. The sun shone out beautifully for a short time, and the weary travelers were strengthened and full of grateful emotion. They tarried here for 2 or 3 hours. On the 6th night, I saw them in a cave near the mount and city of Ephraim. The cave was a wild ravine about 1 hour's distance from the grove of Mamre. I saw the Holy Family arrive, worn out and dejected. Mary was very sad. She wept, for they were in want of everything. They rested here a whole day, and many wonders were vouchsafed them for their refreshment. A spring gushed forth in the cave. A wild goat came running to them and allowed itself to be milked, and they were visibly consoled by an angel. One of the prophets had often prayed in this cave. Samuel had once sojourned in it. David had guarded his father's sheep around it, and to it had often retired to pray. He had in this cave received through angels the divine commands, among them that to slay Goliath. The last stopping place of the Holy Family in Herod's dominion was near its confines. The innkeepers appeared to be camel dealers, for I saw a number of camels in an enclosed pasture ground. The people were rude and wild, and they enriched themselves by thieving. Still, they received the Holy Family most graciously. The place was distant a couple of hours from the Dead Sea. Once I saw Mary sending a messenger to Elizabeth, who then brought her child to a very concealed place in the desert. Zechariah accompanied her only a part of the way. When they reached a certain body of water, Elizabeth and the child crossed over on a raft. while Zechariah went on to Nazareth by the same route taken by Mary on her visit to Elizabeth. I saw him on his journey. Perhaps he was going to make some inquiries, for there were some friends at Nazareth distressed at Mary's departure. On a starry night, I saw the Holy Family going through a sandy wilderness covered with low thickets. The scene was as vivid before me as if I were really crossing the desert with them. Here and there, under the copsewood, venomous snakes lay coiled. With loud hissing, they approached the path and darted their heads angrily toward the Holy Family. But they, shielded by the light that environed them, stepped securely along. I saw other animals with immense fins like wings on their blackish body, with short feet and head like that of a fish. They darted along, flying over the ground. At last, the Holy Family came behind the bushes to a deep fissure in the ground, like the walls of a narrow defile, and here they rested. The last place in Judea by which they passed had a name that sounded like Mara. I thought of Anne's ancestral place, but it was not it. The people were very rude and uncivilized, and the Holy Family could get nothing from them by way of refreshment. Leaving this last place and scarcely knowing how to proceed, they pressed on through a desolate region. They could find no road, and a dark, pathless mountain height stretched out before them. Mary was exhausted and very sad. She knelt with Joseph, the child in her arms, and cried to God. And behold, several large wild beasts like lions came running around them, exhibiting friendly dispositions. I understand that they had been sent to show the way. They looked towards the mountains, ran thither, and then turned back again, just like a dog that wants someone to follow it. At last the Holy Family followed them and, after crossing the mountains, arrived at a very dismal region. End of reading. All right, so notes. First thing, there's actually a pretty big discrepancy here between Mystical City's narrative and this one. Mystical City has Mary not even getting the chance to see Elizabeth, and we remember that Elizabeth actually visited in the period between the birth of Christ and the purification, before they, and she, in Mystical City, she doesn't even get to see Elizabeth. They bolt right after that purification to Egypt. They didn't stop in Nazareth. And the way it came down is that Joseph received the calling in a dream, just like he does here, because that's in the gospel. He receives a calling in a dream, and he basically, Mary actually wanted to stay around longer, but Joseph said, no, the angel told us to go. So Mary obeyed Joseph in Mystical City, which is a good lesson in and of itself. So they didn't stop in Nazareth in that text. However, what they do have in common is that they both understand the extreme hardships that Mary and Joseph had to endure going through the wilderness of Sinai, in the wilderness of South Israel, which is very deserted. And she made special mention of inclemencies in the weather at that time of year, and because it would have been midwinter, close to midwinter by then, and pretty much it's basically the worst time of the year for them to have traveled there in the first place. So just among that, they had to have help from the animals and the angels, and that's mentioned in both texts. Like in Mystical City, she had birds that brought them food and whatnot. All right, next note. This is the important one. We hear about Mary Heli's grandson from Mary, that is from her daughter Mary Cleophas, and her first husband Alphaeus. If you remember the chart I put of the family tree, we see that Cleophas is the mother of a few of the apostles through multiple marriages. Again, we may lament about the short lifespans of adult men, but notice that, again, I pointed this out before, among the Essenes were many of Christ's apostles, and among the people around Capernaum, his exposure to them at an early age is a testament to the requirement of catechesis at a young age in our time, such as when he was in the womb and Mary visited Elizabeth, his nearby exposure to John the Baptist still in the womb cleansed John of sin. Now, he got to many of his apostles early. Now, a lot of Protestants complain about infant baptism. They want it to be a rite of passage, baptism that is, to be a rite of passage and a choice of a man like a bar mitzvah. But this is not the case. Mary gave this very important advice in one of Mystical City's advice sections. I'll read one of the chapters, Volume 1, 412, 412, or 412. But if man neglects to rise above his low desires and his forgetfulness, he yields to the enemy of God and man. The more he alienates himself from the goodness of God, so much the more unworthy does he come of the secret callings of the Most High. So much the less does he appreciate his assistance, though it may be great. For the demon and the passions have obtained a greater dominion and power over his intellect, and have made him more unfit and more incapable of the grace of the Almighty. Thereon, my dear daughter, rests the whole salvation or condemnation of souls, that is, in commencing to admit or resist the advances of the Lord. I desire thee not to forget this doctrine, so that thou mayest respond to the many calls which thou receivest of the Most High. See thou be strong in resisting his enemies, and punctually solicitous in fulfilling the pleasure of thy Lord, for thereby thou wilt gratify him and attend to the commands made known to thee by divine light. I loved my parents dearly, and the tender words of my mother wounded my heart, but as I knew it to be the will of the Lord to leave them, I forgot her house and my people in order to follow my spouse. The proper education and instruction of children will do much towards making them more free and habituated to the practice of virtue, since thus they will be accustomed to follow the sure and safe guiding star of reason from its first dawn. And that's the end of the passage. Now, the people who complain of infant baptism because they do so because they have in themselves a fantasy about having risen to the worthiness in the eyes of God through just their day-to-day existence. It's like, look, I have merited God because I recognize them. This fantasy is just that. It is not real. Real life, kids pay for the mistakes of their parents. We have abortion as a massive testimony to that in our times. God gives us tests, and if we're not prepared for them, we fail them. Just like if teenage boys and girls are not prepared to procreate, they have children, and then they abort them, which is a failure of their virtue. We're more likely to fail them if we do not have an environment that teaches us these tests are coming. Therefore, as adults, We have to contribute to the building of an environment that helps people succeed in these tests so that God can give them more and more graces and more tests so that they can advance the soul in this pilgrimage. Without this, as said in this passage, men can get stuck fighting primitive battles. And God cannot give them more graces and more tests until that man succeeds the earlier ones. So we want to habituate our children as soon as possible. Now, it's possible to get catechized while simply living life. Yes, this is a grace that we're given, but it's not as good as the grace we're given as being privileged as Catholic youth. And this is something where this is an area where the Vatican II Church hurts. They're withdrawing all this stuff. They're throwing people out into the wilderness and letting them get their ass kicked by modernism. And then they come back to the church hobbling and damaged. And then the church is like, oh, well, we were here the whole time. No, you were not. You may have administered communion to us when we were 6, but we didn't know what we were putting in our mouths. And that's one of the big problems of our time. Is we're administered these graces as cradle Catholics. We have no idea what we're being administered to because the catechesis is so poor. But the idea is that the supremacy of the church has a better catechesis than all other institutions in this world. So if you have the cure to a disease, you do not let the disease ravage the person before administering the cure. Why are we getting communion where we're blaspheming our Lord, learning to sin as kins before we get confirmed? This doesn't make sense. Confirmation should come first. We should treasure the Eucharist as much as possible, but we don't. This is a neglect. Instead, and so I say, instead of this negligence, you want to administer the cure as soon as possible so that a person can heal of it. God will make them more exposed to other great diseases afterwards, but this will increase their merit in life. And despite how stupid we are when we were first received communion, it still is, in the end, a grace. But it's an occasion for us to become incredible failures. Whereas Catholics, because they're exposed to all of these graces, they risk being the most among the damned. The most damned, like Judas, would be rotting in the deepest perils of hell because of his proximity to the graces of Christ and him having refused it nevertheless. We are proximate as Catholics to the graces of Christ, but if we fail in this, we may receive the greater condemnation. So, all this being said, some might say it's unfair that some people are spiritually privileged, but keep this in mind, what I just said, that though we are greater spiritually privileged, the demons can make greater use of us. So, this is our danger. So we have to protect ourselves from this danger with gratitude, with the practice of virtue. But remember, always remember, God calls his own and they recognized him. So if you want to define good and evil, justice and injustice, you have to know God first, which is be administered the cure at the start of your life. And then you have a better grasp on what good and evil is and what justice and injustice is. So, for example, there's a lot of gay people that don't like having been made gay. And they ask, well, where were you to protect me, God? The truth is that they were failed, not by God, but by their parents, by their people, by their environments who failed to protect them. But they have a contorted notion of justice because of this failed environment. Whereas those who are exposed, those who find this unfair, and so I repeat, those who find this unfair are the children of those who found it unfair and isolated themselves from God, who did not administer the cure. Original sin infects the reason. When you understand this, you will begin to understand the following: that you are wrong about sin, that you are wrong about justice, that you are wrong about righteousness, just as Jesus said to his apostles, I think in John 16, and that God is right about it, and that you have to drink as much God, that is that Holy Eucharist and holy wine, as possible, and in a certain way, that bitter penance. People who offer suffering to God will always receive, here or in heaven. But if you live only for the things of this world, and this world is a constant catechesis, that is, the demons, the devil, they own it. They constantly catechize you. You have to be administered the cure from the get-go. So when Jesus is exposed to his apostles early, this is precisely the reason. He has to administer the cure. But we have to understand this as a mystery to contemplate. So that's it. Ave Maria.